Thank you so much, Zoe. That was moving and magnificent, and may the history of ICs inspire you to your next great works. So thank you so much. Now I want to introduce Dr. John Pinniger, who will introduce our keynote speaker. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Alan. My role is as the United Kingdom representative on the IC Science Committee, and it's my great pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Louisa Evans. I've got a few notes about Louisa's sort of back history. So Louisa is an environmental social scientist working primarily on marine and coastal ecosystems. She began her training in natural sciences, like a lot of us, but transitioned to social science through her master's and her PhD. Her work draws on geography, development studies, political science, and increasingly the humanities. And already you've heard today the importance of interdisciplinary science, multidisciplinary science, and you're going to hear about transdisciplinary science. She also routinely works with climate scientists, marine ecologists, fisheries scientists, and others, so should be applicable for most of the people in the room here. She's primarily worked overseas in a tropical context before moving to the University of Exeter, where she's now shifted to more sort of UK and European work. She currently leads a big new UK program called the Resilience of Coastal Communities Project under the management of the UK Marine Resources, or the SMMR program, which she's going to explain today. This is going to be a slightly different session. Louisa's going to give a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll have a panel session after that. So please put your hands together for Louisa Evans.
Right, good morning. It's the first time I've used this kind of diva mic, so I just want to check that the back row rebels can hear me okay, and that I'm not blasting your ears off in the front here. Fabulous. Thank you very much for having me. Particular thanks to the UK Science Committee for the invitation and the opportunity to speak to you today. As John has explained, this keynote session will be part presentation and part panel discussion on advancing transdisciplinary marine research and practice. Right, so what is transdisciplinary research? This is a definition taken from the UK Research and Innovation Council, which is the umbrella body that funds a lot of UK research. They acknowledge that there are various definitions, but for them, transdisciplinarity is research that transgresses boundaries between disciplinary knowledge and/or integrates different bodies of knowledge. So actively co-creating knowledge between academic and societal partners. So some of you may be aware of the kind of food-based metaphors that we might use for this, where multidisciplinarity is kind of a traditional meal, right? You might have, hopefully, lots of vegetables, you might have some potatoes, you might have your meat, your fish, your tofu, depending on your preferences. So everything is on the plate, but it's not that mixed together. Excuse me. Interdisciplinarity, then, is more like your paella. So everything is mixed together, but you can still see the kind of constituent ingredients. And transdisciplinary research is like the cake. So everything is so mixed together that you cannot see the individual components anymore. And that's good, right? We all like cake. Cake can solve a lot of problems, but it can be difficult to make cake if you're not so good at baking, right? For me, the key is this statement around different bodies of knowledge and co-creating knowledge with societal partners. So in a nutshell, how can we open up our research and practice to include a diversity of voices, perspectives, and different types of knowledge? And this is my challenge to you today. How can we be braver? So not only thinking about transgressing the boundaries among the sciences, which you're probably all very good at doing now, not only better integrating the social scientists, and I believe there's many of you in the room here today, but thinking about what else we can bring into our knowledge practices. So perhaps working with the arts, certainly working with policy and industry knowledge, and maybe even the knowledge, the sort of experiential knowledge of coastal communities, citizens, and even the publics. So this mirrors the challenge that we were given this morning about thinking about how we can better work together across these kind of boundaries. So the objectives of this keynote session today are to showcase some examples of transdisciplinary research with a diversity of non-academic partners, and to set a tone of sort of curiosity and open-mindedness for the different disciplines, perspectives, knowledges that we'll be sharing at the conference this week. For many of you, I imagine effective transdisciplinarity is still very much a work in progress. It is for me. And so this is a call to action for all of us to continue and to strengthen our efforts in this area. So what I'm going to do in this keynote session, I'm going to introduce the Resilience of Coastal Communities project that I currently lead. I'm going to focus in on 2 examples of our transdisciplinary working within that project. One is primarily with policy collaborators, and the other is collaboration with creatives and communities. I'm then going to invite Rob Clark from the Association of Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authorities, Julie Bremner from CFAS, our Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science, and Sarah Coulthard from the Newcastle University, onto the stage for a discussion about their own experiences of transdisciplinary working from a sort of practice, natural science and social science point of view. Elsbeth MacDonald from the Scottish Fishermen's Federation was due to join the panel too, but sends her apologies. She's been knocked out with COVID and thankfully isn't here to share the love. We don't want to go home with that. But we will miss her in our discussion today. And I do really recommend having a look at what the Scottish Fishermen's Federation have been up to in terms of their collaboration with artists, photographers, and others. And I believe that Sarah can talk to some of that this morning too. I really hope that this is the start of a conversation that, that many of us can continue throughout this week. So, environmental change already impacts the everyday lives of marine resource users and coastal communities in the UK as elsewhere. And these climate and environmental changes increasingly intersect with new and escalating impacts from regulatory change, from economic change, from sociocultural change. Brexit or the exit from the EU and the COVID-19 pandemic being quite obvious examples in the UK. But marine resource users also face numerous smaller scale intersecting adversities. So, for example, market closures, rising energy costs, recent issues in the UK with sewage pollution. Our previous research has shown that marine resource users find it particularly challenging to respond to regulatory change and uncertainty, more so than environmental variability and change. And they find it even more difficult when adversities intersect. So, for example, where they might experience extreme weather events which overlap with limitations to quota or market disruptions. So one of the first aims of our Resilience of Coastal Communities project is to understand how to build resilience to diverse and intersecting challenges. Second, we want to understand how marine resource users and their communities can build resilience to change and disturbance while also improving their well-being and reducing their impact on the marine environment. Now, these three policy objectives often are mutually supportive, but they don't always go hand in hand. So, for example, research has shown that you can have individuals with high well-being but low resilience, and vice versa. So they might have high resilience but low well-being. Or you can have examples of where building resilience involves practices that are detrimental to the natural environment. For example, where they might involve increasing extraction effort, for instance. So there are potential divergence and trade-offs among these three policy objectives, which can compromise policy success. In the ROC project, we explore these concepts as a nexus, and we're very interested in kind of more systematically understanding the synergies, divergence, and potential trade-offs between resilience, human well-being, and marine sustainability. We represent our nexus as three strands of rope. And if we take a cross-section of that rope from the left to the right, your left to your right, what we argue is that in the past, marine policy was fragmented and frayed. So it tackled sustainability, well-being, and resilience as three separate strands of policy without paying attention to how they might intersect and affect each other. More recently, marine policy sees sustainability and the well-being of coastal communities as being intricately woven together. Under turning to trade-offs, there is some recognition that there are trade-offs between these two policy strands, between sustainability and well-being. But resilience remains on the periphery, often subsumed within sustainability and development goals. So under Weaving a Way Forward, we propose a nexus approach that sort of centers and supports all three of these policy objectives, but which is explicit about potential trade-offs among them. All right, so one of the first examples I want to give you from the ROC project is around a new creative collaboration that we have with the National Maritime Museum of Cornwall. So for those of you not too familiar with the UK, Cornwall is the county that's on the foot of England when you look at the map. Under the ROC project, we've collected over 600 even, hours of oral history data on how diverse sets of marine resource users have responded to over 200 different disturbance events over their lifetimes. And we want to share these stories of resilience of coastal communities in Cornwall with the local and international visitors to the museum in ways that are very provocative, quite playful, very memorable. And so we are doing this through the use of these large buoys. So you can see a picture of one of the buoys up there. We have 5 large hand-blown glass buoys, which have technology in them which allows them to play audio content, which responds then to the proximity of an audience member. So the buoys are triggered when you get close to the buoy, and the volume gets louder or less loud, depending on your distance from the buoy. And we have developed these in collaboration with a creative network called Collider. Now, our audio content is still in development and is a little bit top secret, so I can't share it today. But what I will share is some audio content from a smaller creative collaboration with Collider, which is where the buoys originated. In this project, we installed the buoys in community festivals, so it was an outdoor installation. And you can see on your right-hand side a picture of a lady dancing under one of our buoys. So I consider that to be a good day in the office when someone's dancing around your work. The audio content that I'm going to share is a mashup of different voices of fishermen explaining, what motivated them to get into fishing and how they've been responding to change. So it's about a 3-minute clip, so sit back, relax. I hope that you enjoy the very broad accents.
My grandfather, my father, they was all fishermen. We took over, say like 45, 50 years ago.
Barely 15 when I went. Didn't know any different. We'd leave here on a Friday night and all your friends were in the pub and you'd leave for a 3-week trip.
Well, you just come down and help people and whatever, and the nets out, and then you start to, pick fish out, and took it non-deductible, and loved it, absolutely loved it. I wish I did for well.
And as a kid, that was all I wanted to do, school holidays, weekends, more or less living. But the minute I left school, straight into the fishing industry, I left it. I was never, ever going to do anything else.
Tell you my best moment, I was sitting in front of the boat, just breaking daylight, and there was a school of porpoises all around the boat, as far as the eye could see, breaking on the water. God knows how many were there. I looked over the front of the boat, and I made perfect eye contact with one of them. I can still remember that, as if it was yesterday. Obviously, when you're packing good, it's fantastic, but some days when you spin out there and see that much marine life, as in thousands of dolphins around you, you just can't help but, put a smile on your face and seem to change every minute.
Every day visibility is different. Sometimes you see that and you look to Eastbourne, you can't see it. Another day you conversely put your finger out and touch it. It's just amazing, absolutely amazing.
It's the freedom, I think. It's the freedom of just being able to come and go as I please and catch different fish as and when I need to.
You see a chap here who's famous word was, can't wait till tomorrow. And that's when he's going out.
Well, it's not like having a normal job. As soon as you stop, the boat stops, and money stops. I would imagine fishermen are quite hard to live with. It's not like living with a normal person. You kind of married to the job. In the middle of the winter, I've been out there in blizzards in the middle of the night and stuff, just to get a day's work. It's only because it's what I know, I've got to do it. The financial side of it is difficult. Times I'm fairly cope with it. You're sort of trapped as well when you've been a fisherman all your life. What job could I get?
Fishermen are quite good to adjust into what you earn. Some weeks you want to walk up on a cliff and jump off, but then you have a good week fishing and you forget all about it. It's a strange thing to explain really, but one good week's fishing and you're just buzzing in it. You're like your fortune, isn't it?
The only things that control us then was the weather, the markets, what sort of mood we were in when we come there in the morning, But now you've got quotas and different regulations and all this paper that you have to adhere to. It is quite a complicated industry. It appears to have got more complicated as the years have gone by. One of the biggest things that's happened in our lifetime is the fact that things are changing so quickly. And a lot of people can't adapt.
All right, thank you. Glad that worked. So this new collaboration that we are now developing under ROC, is a much more ambitious project. It will run for 12 months within one of the key galleries within the museum, reaching about 125,000 visitors over that time. So we're currently in the process of working with this kind of diverse range of creatives and with our oral history participants to develop the full kind of experience. The exhibition will involve sort of hanging of these 5 glass buoys on the ceiling of the gallery. We have an artistic photographer taking some really beautiful portraits of our oral history participants. We're borrowing objects from some of those participants that have a very long family history working in the marine environment. And we're developing a kind of engaging graphic of these 200 different disturbance events that our oral history participants have identified as impacting them and their communities. So while I've been sort of involved in creative collaborations before, this one has many more moving parts. So we're working with curators, graphic designers, shanty singers, safety technicians. You wouldn't believe how complicated it is to put something up in a museum where you have to protect certain audience members from themselves. So you can't jump and touch them, you can't hit it, you can't throw anything at it, and all these considerations have to be taken into account. as well as things around access. So how do you have a sort of artistic audio exhibit and make sure that people that have some hard of hearing can also engage with the content? So, it's a really steep learning curve, learning the different languages of these kind of collaborators, understanding their aspirations, all at the same time trying to make the most for the oral history participants and their stories that they've shared for us. So really doing justice to those stories. And to give one small example of, the value and the challenges involved in this kind of transdisciplinary work, one of our oral history participants has passed away since we collected her audio. And that shows the real value of oral history work, right? To kind of capture voices, young and old, and understand stories that can be heard into the future. Now, of course, we have all the ethical consent to use that audio content in our exhibit, but it's a very sensitive situation. So we've had to go back to the family of this particular participant and to gain kind of wider consent to be able to use her audio and to photograph her descendants as part of the exhibit. And they're really sort of proud and happy to be involved. I think the other thing I want to point out on this particular example is that this creative collaboration was not identified at the beginning of our research project. It has emerged from the work that we've been doing over the past 3 years, and it has been facilitated by the fact that our SMMR program that funds the ROC project allocated a 4th year of funding specifically to research impact. But I suppose more importantly that they have seen arts-based and creative collaborations and public engagement as valuable parts of that research impact. Just to say, so when we depart for lunch, the conference organisers have very kindly agreed to play you one of the shanty songs that we have collected for this exhibition. It's called Cornish Lads, and it's by the Rum and Shrub Shantymen of Loo. So I hope you enjoy that when we get there. Right, to my second example now. So this one is around trade-off decision-making in UK marine policy. Now, in the ROC project, we see trade-offs as inevitable. So they are present in the status quo, and they will emerge from every type of new policy, management, and investment decision. A trade-off refers to where benefits for certain objectives, certain ecosystem components, certain sectors or stakeholders come at a cost to other objectives or system components. They are not necessarily bad. They've had a bit of a bad rap in the conservation literature, but they're not necessarily bad. They can really tip the scales back in favor of biodiversity or more equitable outcomes. But they are likely to get more contested as our marine spaces become busier and more highly regulated. So we wanted to start by understanding how decision makers in the UK identify and deliberate and deal with trade-offs in their decision-making. And we have 3 key findings that are relevant today. So first, decision makers use a range of tools to identify different impacts and trade-offs from their decisions. So using legal advice, impact assessments, stakeholder consultations, for example. But for the most part within the UK, the deliberation of these trade-offs, so deciding which decisions will be taken forward, happens within government and behind closed doors. Second, we found that there are a number of different factors which influence the acceptability of different trade-offs. So these include hard legal boundaries, current political priorities, the best available evidence. And decisions are sort of funneled through these different factors, leaving relatively little wriggle room, as one of our key informants called it, relatively little wriggle room to then navigate the acceptability or negotiate and deliberate the acceptability of different trade-offs. And so what we found was that there are certain impacts and trade-offs which are less visible than others. And particularly, social impacts and social trade-offs are less visible in decision-making than perhaps economic and ecological ones. So for us, it seemed important to think about how we might have tools and frameworks that can aid a more transparent process of deliberating trade-offs. And so we developed a marine planning trade-off analysis tool. Now, this is informed by participatory and deliberative social science and advice from our policy partners that there are a lot of tools out there that require quite a lot of technical know-how, which in itself is a barrier to uptake by policy and decision-making teams. So we've developed MAPTA as a very low-tech participatory tool. It's designed to lead stakeholders through a step-by-step process to define interventions, identify trade-offs, importantly then to deliberate their acceptability and to develop responses where there are certain trade-offs which might be unacceptable. Now, our MAPTA tool is available online. It was developed during COVID, so you can use it online. And this QR code up here would give you access to the tool online. But it is not a computer-based tool in that it does not have the capacity to input data one end and give you the answer the other end. It is a much more, it's intended as a much more transparent, deliberative process. So I'm going to talk you through one example of how we might use the tool. So on your left, you've got the sort of 10 steps of the facilitated deliberative process, and on the right, I have a kind of replica of what we call our trade-off dashboard. So the first 4 steps of the tool are to identify the particular decision or intervention that you want to analyze, and then to identify and prioritize the parts of your system that you wish to consider within your trade-off analysis. In this particular example, the data is taken from the Lyme Bay sole fishery. Here, the Marine Management Organisation of the UK was working with local stakeholders to identify some new management measures for the sole fishery in response to reports by fishermen that a sort of improved sole stock was perhaps now declining again, and certainly that exploitation of the stock was leading to increased fisher conflict. The intervention that the MMO chose to pilot MAPTA on, well, there were 2. The one I'm showcasing today is around a fishing ban for commercial fishing within 200 yards of the shore. So it was quite a sort of controversial intervention. It was brought up by the consultation process itself, and the MMO used this simply as a thought experiment to work through MAPTA and think through what the trade-offs might be. So the particular elements of the system that they wanted to include, these are just examples from the process, were the sole stock, benthic habitat, other static species, and then with regards to stakeholders, we've got inshore fishers using fixed gear, dredge vessels who catch sole as bycatch, and the recreational anglers. So the first step within the MAPTA tool is for decision makers to allocate a marker to represent the current status of the system. Now, this is important within this tool because this is a sort of negotiated indicator in a way. And that means that who is involved matters. This tool can be used within a management group, right? So it can be based on simply best available evidence and expert advice, or it can be used in a much more participatory and open setting where you might also include these other bodies of knowledge, the knowledge of industry, experiential knowledge of fishermen, and so on. In this particular example, it was a thought experiment, so it was just a management team, but using some of the advice that had come through the consultation process. Next month, we'll use the tool in a much more participatory setting with fishermen down in Plymouth looking at their bass fishery. But what you can see here using our indicators is that the sole stock was in relatively good health. The well-being of inshore fishers was not seen to be particularly good. And then there's a few sort of more moderate indicators for benthic habitat or for the recreational anglers and so on. So the next step within MAPTA is to think about both the direction and magnitude of impact from a particular intervention. So you can see here that there were positive impacts for sole, for benthic habitat, for other static species from the fisheries closure. There were particular benefits for the recreational anglers who had suggested this particular intervention, but there were negative outcomes for the inshore fishers and the dredge vessels. You then, decision makers will allocate a sort of future status indicator to these different components of the system. And this too is an important step because it recognizes that even where you have a positive impact or a negative impact from an intervention, you don't necessarily have enough of an impact to change an outcome for a particular bit of the system or a particular stakeholder. So in this case, there are benefits for the ecological components. So the benthic habitat might improve its status. The sole stock remains at a good status. But as you can see, even with negative impacts for the inshore fishers, they still remain at low well-being, so they're not pushed necessarily any further towards social harm. And the recreational anglers in particular would benefit from this particular intervention. Now, the final and most important bits of this tool are that you then would discuss the acceptability of these different trade-offs. So you use the dashboard as a whole to look back at how the different components intersect with each other. And in this case, the ecological outcomes were seen to be acceptable, right? So the intervention has the potential to improve sole populations and to protect and restore the nearshore habitats. But when it came to the social trade-offs, for the most part, these were unacceptable, but not for everybody. So it was found that there are short-term impacts to the inshore fishers, but potentially longer-term benefits to the fishery in terms of sustainability. And the tool itself can allow you to look at short-term, long-term sort of impacts, which I haven't got on the slide here. They also discussed the fact that the inshore fishers are already at low well-being, so this particular intervention probably wouldn't push them any further to social harm and wouldn't necessarily make a huge amount of difference. But it's obviously very important to understand the experiences of individual operators, and so the response option here was to potentially go and pilot this intervention or to do a little bit more research around these social thresholds of harm. Now, what I want to point out quickly here is that we're working on social thresholds of harm, but actually if you want fisheries that are thriving and not just surviving, you might want to think about acceptability at higher levels of well-being, for example. So you might not be interested just in social thresholds of harm, but you might be interested in defining thresholds which relate to thriving fisheries. So I have three sort of take-home messages from these two examples, and I've kind of put these under the three core themes of the funding program that ROC is funded under. One is about understanding values, another around building tools, and the third around supporting policy. Now, research and science is often about understanding things, right? In this case, understanding values. But what I'm trying to showcase through some of our examples is that transdisciplinary working doesn't only understand value, but can co-create new values, so new experiences. In our case with the museum, new experiences for their audiences, but also new experiences for our oral history participants, for policy guests that we might invite to the exhibit, and so on. So we can push the boundaries, we can go further with our transdisciplinary work. When it comes to building tools, of course, tools are helpful, decision support tools are helpful, but there are also a lot of tools out there. So we need to think a little bit more critically about what we want the tools to do. What change do we really want to achieve with these? In the UK and European context, we have hugely sophisticated data collection, machines and processes. We have a lot of information, we have a lot of knowledge, and yet we still have some really significant evidence gaps and knowledge gaps. From our point of view, a lot of these are around social impacts and social trade-offs. And so we would argue that we need more tools that are transparent, deliberative type of tools. And the third element here is around supporting policy. And of course, policy impact from research is kind of the gold standard, what we're all trying to aim for, what the funders want us to aim for. In the UK, we have a very active policy space. We also have very open-minded policy collaborators, who are happy for you to look under the hood as much as to kind of do the kind of work that they're commissioning. And that's not the case everywhere. So it's been a real privilege to work with a lot of our policy collaborators in the UK, often within their evidence teams. But I think what I'm trying to show through these examples is that we can also think outside the box a bit in terms of who we are collaborating with. There's a lot of other levels of action and work at which we can make an impact, and we can be a bit more innovative in thinking through who we are collaborating with. All right, so that's it for a sort of scene-setting introductory presentation from me. Obviously, the ROC work is not mine alone, and I want to thank my ROC collaborators and partners, as well as the funders and the SMMR programme. I do now want to invite our panel guests up onto the stage, so Rob Clark, Julie Bremner, and Sarah Coulthard. And we'll move over to our discussion. Thank you. All right, thank you. So hopefully they also have a Diva mic that is switched on. I don't know if it's one by one or whether you're all on. So what I've asked my colleagues to talk to us about and to share today is perhaps first about the kind of main mission of their work, and then really around how they're working in transdisciplinary ways and their experiences of this. So we are going to sort of go in order of the panel here, and we're going to start with Rob Clark from the Association of Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authorities. Hi, Rob. Thank you very much for joining. Are you all right to tell us a little bit more about what you're up to at the moment and what it is as you see as the key, benefits or challenges of working in transdisciplinary ways?
Super. So I work for the Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authorities, and they are charged with the management of inshore fisheries, balancing the needs of different users in decision-making as to how we allocate resources and how the members decide how to protect our marine protected area network in England. In England, we have one of the largest inshore fisheries in Europe by number. And also we have a very long history of managing at a local level. So since the 1890s, inshore fisheries have been managed through local authorities. So the IFCAs, 10 of which in England, have a duty to manage sustainable fisheries and our marine protected area network. So how do they do that? Well, the membership is, I think, what's particularly relevant to this research, is composed of local councillors elected by their councils who pay the bills, but also have a democratic mandate to look after their local constituencies. Marine scientists are on our committees as well. Members of IFCAs are members. But perhaps most importantly, we might say for this research at least, we have members of the fishing industry and members of the recreational community. So they come together and make decisions how to allocate resources and how to make long-term and short-term decisions about the sustainable use of our inshore waters. So what are the sort of, I think that space, the place where those different and diverse groups come together to bring their different types of knowledge, their different types of evidence, working together within a legal framework is I think, hugely valuable. And I would argue one of the reasons why we actually have one of the best developed networks of actually managed marine protected areas in our inshore waters, at least. Not talking to the offshore waters. And why we still have, despite it facing many challenges, a very large inshore fleet. But the challenge here, I would argue, is ensuring that on the one hand we might be a really great delivery body for national policy, but is national policy listening to the synthesis and the knowledge that is generated through our organisations? To what extent are we able to feed back up and make the agenda? And yeah, so thank you very much for this opportunity, and also more widely for participating in the research.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob. And I think we would love to hear some more about how you have found that experience of trying to feed up. But let's go round the room and then we can come back. Julie, thank you very much for joining. Julie is from CFAS, and I think has loads of experience to share around the transdisciplinary aspects of her work. So over to you, Julie.
Thank you, Louisa. I suspect I have lots of errors and mistakes to share with you. Hi folks, I'm Julie Bremner. I'm an ecologist at CFAS, and as an aside, I'm absolutely delighted, I don't know if Dan's still in the room with us, to see that a benthic ecologist won the Prix d'Excellence this year. We're at the bottom of the food chain generally in most ways, so it's absolutely fantastic. Many congratulations to Dan. So I guess I've been working, and I'm an ecologist, so by my very nature I'm interested in how things connect together. How the animals and the plants starting off on the seabed connect to everything else. So I suppose for me it was quite a natural extension to start thinking about that broader sense, coming out from the seabed, coming up to the plankton and the fish, and then coming outwards to the people. So I probably about a decade now I've been working in this kind of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, and we might perhaps have a discussion about the distinction between these or the nuances between them. And lots of different projects with lots of different types of people, quite a lot of work with policymakers. Of course, I work for CFAS, we're owned by DEFRA, but also a lot of work with industry, the energy industry, and some work with the fishing industry as well. I've got a couple of projects at the moment I think are really interesting for two different ways. One is an EU project called Marbifis. I'm the science leader for this project, and we are looking at, a little bit like your ROC project, looking at the biodiversity and how to manage it and the value. The different ways that we can put value onto biodiversity, so that the ways that they're valuable just inherently as being parts of the environment, parts of our natural world, the economic value, but also that socio-cultural value. And we're having a lot of adventures at the moment with stakeholders in that project and trying to understand actually what that really means when we say value of something, and very, very different viewpoints on what that might mean. And the other one that's really exciting me at the moment is a project called One Food, which is a project funded by DEFRA, trying to look at entire food systems. So trying to understand the problems or the hazards present within food systems in their entirety as a holistic concept. So thinking about the food that we produce, is it safe, is it nutritious? What does it mean for human well-being? What does food mean for health and safety, nutrition, medical illnesses? What does it mean for, I guess, social cultural connections as well? Food's got really, really strong social cultural connection. And what does it mean for the environment? Obviously, that's one that's going to be quite close to my own heart personally, but what does it mean to produce food for the environment? And we're trying to do that across the entire food system. So that is not just looking at fisheries, it's not just looking at aquaculture, it's looking at everything. And aquatic food has got so much to deliver and so much to give to food production. We all eat, we need food, and we don't have enough of it. And it's really, really, really interesting at the moment in this project to see how we can bring aquatic foods into that discussion, that much broader discussion with people that are raising cows and chickens and putting aquatic food in there. So that's another one. At the moment, that it's less of a stakeholder challenge with that, and I think it's more about there's such a different group of disciplines working together, a huge number of different disciplines. How we get people who've got a shared view on how to get forward, how do we get them into a space together mentally and physically to do that? So those are things that are challenging me quite a bit at the moment and definitely taking me very far outside of my comfort zone.
And can I ask a quick question by way of follow-up then? So do you find, because my impression is that terms like value are purposefully in there because they're open enough that we can all participate in some way with our own impression of what that might be, right? So it can be quite good to, as a boundary object, to bring different disciplines and even different knowledge holders together. Similarly, this kind of One Health concept, I think, is meant to be a sort of boundary object so that people can come in from their different perspectives to the table. Do you find them helpful in that sense, or have you found them too woolly to be helpful?
That's a really good question. I think my answer is probably different to both of those. On the value one, it's really divisive. It's really divisive. You know, I personally, as an ecologist, was very resistant to the concept of economic value of nature when I first started working in this space about 5 years ago. I'm not sure what my thoughts are now. I'm much more open to the conversation. But, you know, it's really, really divisive. What I think is valuable is not the same as what you think is valuable. It's not the same as what you think is valuable. And how do we bring that in? And I don't know if, in that way, that word value maybe makes the conversation harder. Because it does take people towards that dollar sign, the euro sign, the pound sign, that maybe we need to step back a little bit from and think about what we're saying is about what's important to people. So that one, I think, is difficult. The One Health one, I think, is really... so I guess for colleagues in the audience that might not know what this concept is about saying that the health of animal and plants, the health of the environment, and the health of people are all equal, and they should all be equally considered. And I think that's a concept everybody can get behind, but maybe it needs a little bit of, because it's so big, it needs a little bit of some tools to help us to get in to discover what that actually means.
I love, earlier today we were at coffee and Julie was saying how she's so impressed when she works with medics, which is one of her new collaborators under the One Health thing. And it's so true that we bring a whole different range of expertise together. Thank you. Sarah, would you like to share some of your experiences and thoughts from a marine social science point of view?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm Sarah Coulthard from Newcastle University, a marine social scientist. I've just completely changed what I was going to say in the last few minutes, having listened to you all. So go with me on this. But what struck me as you've all been speaking, and especially Louisa when you were talking about the map to tool, was how interesting it is that the more information and knowledge we have about something, actually the more difficult it becomes to make a decision about it. And this then reminded me of an excellent bit of writing by Amartya Sen, whom some of you may have heard of. He was a Nobel Prize-winning economist who's written many books. And in about 2001, he wrote a brilliant novel called Development as Freedom, which had a huge influence on international development research and practice. And in that book, he starts off by sharing a story about, I'm sure you will know this story, Louisa, about 3 children who are arguing over a flute. And I think it's got real relevance to some of what we're discussing about. So if you just bear with me, I will relate it. It won't take me too long. So there are 3 children arguing about a flute. The first child says that she should have the flute because she's the child who made the flute. So really it is hers. Okay, very reasonable argument. If you were only listening to that one child, you'd be saying, okay, that's fair enough, here you go. But then the second child comes along and says that really he should have the flute because he's the only one in the room that can play the flute and therefore can distribute the greatest happiness to the greater number of people. But then the third child speaks up and says that she should have the flute because she has no other instruments to play with or indeed any other toys, and so she should rightfully have it. And Amartya Sen uses this for all sorts of very clever ways in his writing to introduce this idea of development as freedom. But I think the most relevant part of that story for this discussion is that the more layers of knowledge you gain through interdisciplinary working, through working with communities and through working with industry, the more difficult it becomes to make a decision about how to distribute fish resources, which is what we're fundamentally always talking about. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important to have a platform to have really good informed debate about that. And that's where organisations that are in regions, like fishermen's organisations like the IFCAs, become so important, because they create that space to have that debate with all these different priorities and perspectives, but really fully heard out and supported by evidence that is generated by those IFCAs and the scientists who work with them. Because if you think about it, if you had those 3 squabbling children, and I'm very glad to have left mine behind this morning for the duration of the week, I'm far too excited about that. But you could come along from a kind of top-down government perspective and just say, right, I'm going to give it to child number 1, right? Or you could just have one child in the room, because that's all you've been able to engage with, because it's so difficult to get some of these other children in the room. And I'm sorry to use the child analogy here, but you get what I mean. It's very difficult always to reach all of those stakeholders. And I think often it's really difficult and increasingly difficult, I would say, to engage with our fishing communities, who are increasingly fed up, I think, of giving their time into research projects, and often they don't see the fruits of that effort, because as scientists we aren't always very good at communicating things back to those communities. And so it's so brilliant to see in your presentation about the innovative use of arts to do exactly that. And I think just sort of the main thing as well, just moving on a bit from, we were talking earlier about partnerships. And I think what's coming through really strongly in what you've all been saying, how important that is. But if we think about what partnerships are made of, it's about relationships and communication. And I'm just cringing because I sound like my marriage counsellor who says that all the time. But she's right. And all of life is about that, right? Relationships with each other, how we communicate. And research is no different to that. And I think as a scientist, it's really hard to maintain those relationships, especially with communities that we don't often have enough time to spend time with. If I could, I'd spend every day on the harbour chatting to fishermen, but I'm hardly ever there. I've got all these other things, we all have these other things that we're having to do. So what I've really learned over the last few years is working with those organisations who do have those relationships, who are embedded in regions. So again, the IFCAs and others who are out there on a daily basis talking to fishermen all the time, and that has really helped facilitate some of the work I've done in partnership with those organisations. So the amount of times I'll be in a harbour somewhere, and sometimes a fisherman will come and find where I am, because the enforcement officer of the IFCA has seen him out at sea, and they said, Sarah's in the harbour today doing this survey, you might want to look her up. She'll be sat looking miserable because everyone's too busy and tired to talk to her. And he'll come and find me because of the relationship he has with that IFCA officer who he sees very regularly at sea. And I think if we don't have those relationships already as scientists, working with those who do is a really good way forward, and that then enables us to access the knowledge that we need to get to create these sorts of interdisciplinary debates.
Yeah. No, I really second that, actually. In the ROC project, in the different counties that we're working, our key partnerships in some ways, or the first ones we started with, were these very trusted networks who work with the communities and the particular stakeholder groups from the start, because they will be there long after we have had to move on to various other things. So back to you, Rob. I was interested then in, I suppose, how you build these kind of trusted partnerships within the IFCA. And I'm sure, people will know that there are some examples of IFCAs that work very well, and there are examples of IFCAs that are perhaps a little bit more conflictual, and whether you kind of learn anything from those two different models.
Thank you. So I think, sort of talking to the issue of tensions, very often those can be traced to not necessarily the model itself, but perhaps more the solubility of the issue at hand.
Okay.
So some challenges can take a very, very long time, and I think the point that you make is really relevant about longevity. And those relationships will, as with any relationship, will go through peaks and troughs. But the point is that you have a space and a capacity to work through them, because if they are left unresolved, then you don't move forward. So I guess that was my first point. But when I was sat in the audience listening to your wonderful presentation, I was listening to the voices, and I'm pretty sure that's Hastings.
Some of them, yes.
Okay, great, because
Yes.
the first chap who came up, I remember a very long time ago in 1999, in my first job as a fishery officer, my training induction, which has changed now for the better in most part, was being placed on a fishing boat with one of our committee members to learn about what the job was. And so what that meant was I, from an early stage, had something of a first-hand understanding of the challenges that are faced, which meant when the decisions that my authority at the time was deliberating and coming to, we could place, I had the ability to place in context some of those understandings. So rather than coming with here's what the science says,
Yes. Yeah.
actually in practical terms, what does that mean for cod end or a pot design, or what is the working resolution of those issues? So I guess to answer your question, it's having the time and space to work embedded in communities, and having the first-hand experience, and having the space to share experiences in a transdisciplinary
way. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I notice, probably less so, but also within industry, there is a lot of permeability among the organisations now. Certainly, there's a lot of researchers who move to government and then move to different agencies within government. There's a lot more kind of placement type of working. You know, Sarah, I know that you've spent some time in placement at MMO as part of your researcher role. So we do learn each other's different languages in some way that way. And perhaps it is that we need to spend more time on fishing boats too, and things like that. Or bring fishers into some of our working practices, I suppose, yeah. So I think it may well be time for some audience questions and reflections, but I did want to ask whether there was anyone else who had a final thought on the panel. Julie, whether you wanted to add
Always, but
anything
I
to
think,
wrap it up?
Yeah, always, but I think let's go to questions. Give me a mic,
All
I
right,
can talk
sorry,
forever.
partly because I don't have a watch, so I think we must be getting quite close to lunch. Yeah. So, as I understand it, or I think I understood it, there might be, is that right? A roving mic, yeah. And this is to invite your questions and reflections, if you have any, audience members, and to say thank you very much for your attention today. So there's someone with a microphone at the back there. So I guess if you could put your hand up, it's hard to see, actually. So we have a question in the royal box over here on the right.
Very good.
Yeah. And we'd love a quick introduction to who you are as well as your question, if we may.
Yes, Dora
Thank you.
in Norway. Thank you, Louisa and panel. My
Thank you.
question is about power asymmetry in decision making. We at IC do a lot of single stock assessments, for example, and that has a lot of power in negotiation. So with all the very important talk about transdisciplinary values, which of course I totally support, #epistemic justice, we have to talk about the power in the room. And I would like the panel to maybe reflect on their experiences with power and decision making.
Yes, that's a very good question, and there are probably lots of different levels at which that work. I think ICES is quite an illustrative example where scientific power has held quite a lot of political power and vice versa, right? It struck me a little bit hearing about the history of ICES that perhaps it was as much about geopolitics as it was about fish, right, and sustainability. And I mean, I don't know really how that kind of power is negotiated through ICES and down through governments and so on, but it is clearly highly controversial when we think about the experiences of the fishermen. So, a large number of this kind of rejection of the UK's involvement in the EU, and certainly working with fishermen around the time of Brexit, a lot of the feeling was that Europe and the decisions that are made, and it's projected onto Europe, I'm not saying that they are European decisions, is so far removed, the power is so extreme, that the only thing we can do is use our vote, really. So they used a kind of much more local level political power, as it were, to reject the current system, as it were. I don't know if others have some thoughts on how to navigate that without it being resistance and opposition, I suppose.
Yeah, just that's a great question, a really important question, of course. As a social scientist, I feel like I need to say something about this, but I think what I've learned from working in government and from being a scientist is that there's such, I mean, scientists obviously have a huge role, but we often get frustrated if our science isn't always listened to, because there are always politics at play. But there was another great book by a guy called Majoni who talks about the use of science in policy making. And he says that he challenges scientists to be more forward-thinking and not just produce the evidence, but also think about the construction of their argument that they're making with that evidence. Because I think often we stop at the production of the evidence bit and we write it up in a peer-reviewed journal. We don't then go further all the time and make arguments, and we very rarely think about who we need to persuade. And so Majoni talks about these three elements of influencing policymakers. So evidence, generating an argument, and then really engaging with those different audiences, including the industry, who you're trying to persuade with your evidence-based argument. And that, again, I'm not going to talk about IFCAs the whole time, but that is exactly what happens in an authority meeting. They have to persuade each other and have that open debate. And that's where power is, I suppose, brought to account a bit more. It's always there, and it's an imperfect system. It always is, and it's a difficult thing to work with. But I think there's many examples, and I don't have time to go into them, but there are examples where you can think of where power has perhaps been one-sided, but where there have been evidence-based arguments that have been continually put forward, and by a collective multi-organisation approach, where everyone starts to say the same thing, then power starts to change a little bit, and good change can happen. Yeah.
Yeah. And I believe the impetus is as much on us to be self-reflective and self-critical in terms of how we portray robust science and all that sort of thing. Part of the challenge is for us to open that up, I think, a bit. Yeah. Any other questions, Sorry, runners, we have someone now on there we have another one there, so you scrabble across. Thank you, and then someone in the audience. We can't hear you quite yet, no.
Hello?
Yes, hello.
Thank you. That's all very thought-provoking. It made me think a lot of things. And this somewhat comes off the back of the sleeping question, but maybe it's a step before that. Values, personal values, group values. Have you considered, and how do you go about comparing different people's and different groups' values? We're mostly scientists, so we like to quantify, or at least we quantify things. But how do you go about justifying one group of considerations or perspectives against another group? I'm really interested in that and in how to go about that. And I know that communication is key to it and really, really important to it. But before we get into the dynamics of the power in the room, do you have a means or have you tried to experience of how you lay that out and how you might go about pulling things like that together?
Thank you. Another great question. Julie, I'm going to ask if you can start with some reflections on that, and then I have some also to share.
I was going to pass that one across to Sarah as a social scientist. It's all about conversation, and it's all about everybody feeling that they have an equal voice in the conversation. I was really struck by, I'm going to paraphrase Mike Rowe here, his comment that none of us has a monopoly on knowledge. I think that was, give or take, what you said there. And I think it's the mindset that you come into the conversation with goes a long way. This is maybe a little bit different answer than you were looking for in terms of how do we maybe quantify those different values. But if you can start off to create a situation where in the conversation everybody feels that they have an equal voice and that their viewpoints, I guess first of all acknowledging they're going to have different viewpoints and different worldviews, and then allowing those to happen and not fighting against them or trying to correct them, and then acknowledging that everybody has a viewpoint and that they're all valid and listening to them all. I've spent a little bit of time working with partners in the South Pacific, and in the Pacific they have a really interesting approach to this kind of conversation, that they will sit in a circle and everybody in the circle gets to speak, and everybody in the circle gets to speak for as long as they want to speak. And nobody will interrupt them, nobody will argue with them, they'll have a conversation afterwards, but everyone gets to express that viewpoint. And I think that's, that kind of concept's a really good starting point, taking yourself into the conversation, being open and saying everybody here is valid. It's not quite an answer to how do you then quantify that. I don't have an answer for that one, but it's a very long conversation. But it's about how you start off in that space.
Yeah, may I add a reflection? Because I have found it interesting that a number of funding, calls wish you to research values. And there's a lot of understanding that there are some gaps around the socio-cultural, maybe we're okay at the economic and so on, but we need to expand how we think about values. But what did strike me was that there was a sense that if you can understand values, and particularly if you can quantify or extract them from the people who hold those values, you might be able to say something about how people respond to a management intervention. So in some ways that values are predictive of behavior. So depending on whether you speak to a psychologist or other types of social scientists, that would be debated, right? On the other side, there's a little bit of skepticism around values, because you can ask someone about their values on different days and you can get slightly different answers, again, depending on what kinds of values you're talking about. So they are too fluid to be pinned down to be predictive or robust over time, I would say, to some extent. But what is interesting about values is that they can, I think, say something around people's thresholds of acceptability, and you can think about, say, particular thresholds of harm or acceptability where if you cross them, you really fundamentally go against someone's values. And that might be one way that we can think about values that isn't as precise, I suppose, as we need. So we might think about, where we can build some understanding of where acceptability is crossed or not. And there's some really interesting research internationally about what they call taboo trade-offs, so where particular trade-offs seem to be invisible, but they will suddenly really counter someone's internal cultural values and something like that, and then they become incredibly unacceptable. Yeah. I think, sorry, we might have to wrap up, but we're around certainly for the lunch break and the rest of this week, and we look forward to conversations with others of you here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you very much, you three.
Yeah, so we would like to thank all of the panel members, and especially Louisa, and I've got a few gifts from ICES.
Thank you, that's very kind of you.
Thank you, Louisa. Thank you to our panelists. And so lunch is outside. I want to quickly mention there's a network session that's at Thursday at noon that didn't make it into the program, and so you can search for Game Show in Hoover. And there's a survey that you can fill out for that. So if you take the time to do that, that'd be great. And lunch is served outside, so enjoy and look to Hoover for what to do after this. So thank you all very much for a great kickoff session. Take care.
What